Wow, that's really psychedelic. Yeah, I can't help it.
Good afternoon, fellow Rotarians and guests. Our speaker today is Mark Haden. He is the Executive Director of MAPS Canada, which stands for Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia School of Public and Population Health. In his career, Mark has published on the issue of drug control policy, including psychedelics, in journals such as the Canadian Journal of Public Health, the International Journal of Drug Policy, and the Encyclopedia of Public Health. Mark has worked in addiction services in counseling and supervisory roles and has provided public education on drugs and drug policy for over 30 years. He has also worked with the Health Officers Council of British Columbia on their position papers on the issue of a regulated market for all currently illegal drugs. In 2013, Mark was awarded the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for drug policy reform work. And now, here's Mark.
Thank you, Milton. Psychedelics are back. If I had one slide to show you why psychedelics are back, it's this slide here. There are many top-ranked, prominent universities around the globe that are actively engaged in psychedelic research. It ranges from Johns Hopkins Medicine to the Imperial College of London to Harvard Medical School to McMaster University, McLean Hospital, Stanford School of Medicine are all involved with psychedelic research. And the Canadian Medical Association Journal, the conservative voice of physicians across Canada, had this as their cover article. And there were two articles in here exploring the psychedelic renaissance, what research has happened recently. Those are university and academic views on psychedelics. There is a popular reason why psychedelics are back, which is Michael Pollan's book. Michael Pollan, who wrote many books about food, has a huge following, and he wrote a book about his exploration of the community of people that are researching psychedelics, and quite frankly, his own experiences. And I get 100 emails a day exploring various things around psychedelics. And I would say about 20 emails a day to say, I read Michael Pollan's book, and they finish the sentence. But this book has completely raised the issue of psychedelic medicine, psychedelic research, psychedelic science within the popular community. So I want to reflect a little bit on the words that we're using, because the word psychedelic is actually carefully chosen by the research community. And there were lots of choices. The first word to describe psychedelics was psychomimetic, which means mimicking mental illness. That was used in the 50s. And then hallucinogen became a word which means seeing stuff. But it really doesn't describe why researchers are interested. The word empathogen means to connect with others, and psychedelics sometimes experience a profound closeness with others. And the word entheogen is about manifesting of the spirit. But none of the last two I would describe as positively weighted, and the first two are negatively weighted. The most neutral and most accurate term is psychedelic. It means manifesting of the mind, and it doesn't have a positive or a negative weighting. And so that's the word that researchers have chosen. We also understand it has historical baggage. Psychedelic arts, psychedelic community, and that's unfortunate, but nevertheless, the word itself is the best word. So if we look at what happened, psychedelics are largely currently criminalized. Why is a very interesting question. Because they were linked with an anti-social message in the 1960s. There was a battle that happened between the younger folks, the hippies, the people who didn't want to fight in the Vietnam War, and the older folks who really wanted that war to continue and really wanted the younger folks to fight. And that battle resulted in the criminalization of the drugs that the younger folks were using. And even if you look at the documentation that reflected when they did it, when they criminalized it, the evidence was minuscule. In fact, it was fabricated. LSD will damage your chromosomes. It's not true. And so it really was a process of cultural change. And it wasn't about the 15 years of research that had happened before it was criminalized that showed significant promise. A lot of that research actually happened in Canada. In Weyburn, Saskatchewan, they generated thousands of research reports and peer-reviewed journal articles and had tens of thousands of subjects go through their experiments. And it was shown to be incredibly promising. And in spite of the promise, it was criminalized. And it's interesting to look at the media who got involved with the process of propaganda. LSD-fed ape rapes TV actress. LSD made me a prostitute, and my personal favorite. Girl gives birth to frog. LSD is bland. So it's interesting, what happened as a result of the criminalization of psychedelics is the research was banned. Now, when else in human history has research been criminalized? Well, actually, I can think of an example. Back in the day, back specifically in 1616, and then for the subsequent 143 years, it was illegal to report what you saw through the lens of the telescope. Specifically, that the Earth was not the center of the universe. Here's a quote. LSD is to the study of the mind what the telescope is to astronomy and what the microscope is to biology, from Stanislav Grof. So I'd like to reflect on the emergence or the re-emergence of psychedelic research. And for me, I became aware of it with this particular article in the New York Times. I just kind of reflect a bit on mainstream media presentation of this renaissance that's happening. Hallucinogens have doctors tuning in again. New York Times Magazine, how psychedelic drugs can help patients face death. New York Times, can mushrooms treat depression? The New Yorker, this was Michael Pollan's first article, the trip treatment. And when Michael was writing this article and then submitted it to the editor said, find somebody who will challenge you. We need to have both voices. We don't want to just have a prose psychedelic article. We need to have two voices. So Michael said, okay, give me a name of somebody to go and find out who I should interview. And the editor did, and he went and he gave his manuscript to the person who was supposed to challenge him. And he looked at the article and he said, this looks pretty straightforward. I'm not going to challenge this. So it appeared unchallenged, which was an interesting piece of editorial history. The Globe and Mail, psychedelic drugs may be helpful in the treatment of addiction, anxiety, and PTSD. Newsweek, psychedelics promise a paradigm shift in treating mental illness. Maclean's magazine, is ecstasy an answer? This is a reflection on the PTSD study that I'll talk about. The New Yorker again, the science of the psychedelic renaissance. And then the New York Times, Michael Pollan drops acid and comes back convinced. So those are all mainstream media, but I know what you're thinking. What does Fox News think about this? Well, I'm glad you asked. Fox News has been very positive about psychedelic research, much to my surprise. Here's an example. MDMA for PTSD, how ecstasy ingredient works in the brain. And in the more academic analysis explores potential psychedelic treatments for mental illness. And here's one by a very prominent psychiatrist who's been writing a lot about psychedelics. His name is Ben Sessa, or psychedelic drug treatment seeing a comeback in psychiatry. Now, it's curious, my father was a psychiatrist, and he was a psychiatrist in the 50s and 60s. And he saw the change where mental health medications were developed and allowed patients to leave hospitals. They could support people in communities. It was a huge transition in the history of psychiatry. There hasn't been a change since, up until now. In fact, my life partner, is a psychiatrist, and I looked her straight in the eye and said, the work we are doing is going to transform your profession. And there are many psychiatrists that believe that. This will be absolutely huge in the impact that it'll have on psychiatry. Psychedelic healing, hallucinogenic drugs, which blew the minds in the 60s, soon may be used to treat mental illness. So I want to talk about how academics, how researchers are thinking about psychedelics. How do they understand them taxonomically? So they break them into three groups. There's the classical psychedelics, LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, and dimethyltryptamine. And what they're being explored for is a sense of spirituality. And that's being actually measured. How do you measure spirituality? Well, that's a very interesting question, but it's being done in great detail now. There's an element of disorientation of the ego that happens with these medicines, and that can be very helpful for treating things like alcoholism. They're unconscious amplifiers. They're non-specific unconscious amplifiers. People get a sense of what's going on in their unconscious minds in a way they don't during normal waking states. The portal effect is huge. The portal effect is the feeling of transition accomplishment. Similar to climbing Mount Everest or graduating from university. It's this, wow, that was an incredible experience. And that's very helpful in the treatment of many conditions. Substance use disorder treatment, everything from alcoholism to tobacco cessation. Depression treatment, end-of-life anxiety treatment are all being explored with the classical psychedelics. The empathogens, connection to others, or entactogens, connection to self, are MDMA, 3-MMC, MDA, are examples of those. And they really bond people together. The connection to others is profound with these. Also a huge level of connection, reflection on self, and reduction of fear. Therefore, MDMA is the ideal treatment for PTSD, because often PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is an experience in the unconscious mind that is encrusted with fear. And to allow people to access it without the huge fear response results in a level of effectiveness of PTSD treatment that is unparalleled. And then there's the other psychedelics, which is the grab bag of everything else. So things like ibogaine, which is useful in the treatment of opiate use disorders, ketamine, which is useful in the treatment of depression, 2CB, salvia-dorm, divinorum, there's a whole variety of them. So this is basically everything else. I want to talk about the research that I'm most involved with, which is the MDMA, methylene dioxymethamphetamine, assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. It started with Michael Mithofer's study. So I went to the CIMVR conference, which is the Canadian Military Health Conference. And at the CIMVR conference, it's essentially people pitching the military on their PTSD treatments. PTSD is the issue the military struggles with the most. So I spent 5 days wandering around this environment, watching people pitch the military on their treatments. The most level of effectiveness that was claimed by anybody was 25% effective. The research says it's 10% effective. So it was with great interest that Michael Mithofer did research and demonstrated a level of effectiveness. By that he meant people were no longer classifiable with PTSD at an 83% level of effectiveness. 83. So from 10% to 83%. If you're a researcher and you look at that gap between 10% and 83%, you're essentially going to say they're falsifying their data. They're lying. That can't be that true. No treatment is ever offered for an alternate treatment that demonstrates that significant shift. It's usually 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5%. So 10% to 83%. So how do you prove you're not falsifying your data? Well, what you have to do is you have to do it again. You have to do it again at many sites in many countries with lots of oversight. So we did it in Canada, and the oversight was the Ministry of Health. And in the United States, it was the FDA. And so we did our phase 2 clinical trial. So that meant there was over 100 subjects at the different sites. And so the data from the phase 2 clinical trial, which has been presented to both the FDA and Health Canada, showed that the comparator dose, the placebo dose, had a 23% 23% level of effectiveness. After 2 months of follow-up, the main dose had a 55% level of effectiveness. After 2-month follow-up for 3 sessions, it was 61%, and the aggregate data for all of the subjects who had had MDMA-assisted psychotherapy was 67.8%. 67.8%. So it looks like Michael wasn't lying. It looks like what we have here is the most significant treatment for PTSD that exists. The FDA has looked at it in the United States and granted this research breakthrough status, which basically means it's so promising they would like people to access it quickly. So we finished our phase 2 clinical trial in Vancouver, and we're about to start our phase 3 clinical trial. We don't have the same easy access. Curious enough, because of Donald Trump, there's a new piece of legislation in the States, which is called the right to try legislation, which means that they can actually start providing MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD treatments this year in the United States. They're way ahead of us. We have to go through this whole other process in Canada that's much more convoluted. It'll probably take years. I think I've gone through that. So here we go. Is ecstasy an empathogen? One of the reasons why MDMA-assisted psychotherapy works is because it bonds somebody with PTSD with a therapist. And the greatest predictor of any therapy, the greatest predictor of success of any therapy is the alliance between the therapist and the subject. And MDMA is a huge bonding agent. Unconscious material in a way that is relaxed and doesn't have a huge fear response. Now, I participated in the MAPS therapy training, and it was absolutely fascinating because honestly, I didn't believe what I saw. I believed on some level that Michael and Annie Methofer would be cherry picking. They would be finding single incident trauma veterans who are healthy young men and had gone to battle and had one really nasty experience and came back with a problem, but they had access to a healthy young man in their brain somewhere, that the resources they could tap into and then produce subsequent health. And I didn't see that. What I watched was videotapes forever of the people who'd been through the program. And what I saw was complex trauma. Trauma that had happened to people from childhood. I spent 30 years working for the addiction services. I worked in the downtown east side. The downtown east side is absolutely full of trauma. It's full of complex trauma. That's what you're seeing. This is a trauma community, and it's a complex trauma community. And having worked there for years, I can tell you it's really, really hard to treat. It appears that we now have a treatment. I just want to explore some of the other research that's going on. Here's a wonderful study. The antidepressive, anxiolytic, and the addictive effects of ayahuasca, psilocybin, and LSD, a systematic review of clinical trials published in the last 25 years. And what the results of this particular systematic review was, we need to bring back psychedelics into mainstream psychiatry. It appears that psychedelics are incredibly helpful in treating tobacco addiction. Now, I worked in the addiction services for most of my career. We had, at the end of my tenure with Vancouver Coastal Health, a tobacco cessation program. We weren't very effective. No tobacco cessation programs are very effective. None of them. Maybe 10%, 15%, maybe 25%. This particular piece of research was done by Matthew Johnson and Roland Griffiths. They took 15 people who had long histories of tobacco use. 12 of them were abstinent from tobacco at the end of the study. 80% effectiveness. That's never happened. I've never seen any research that has demonstrated that level of effectiveness. Alcohol dependence. Again, alcohol dependence is very hard to treat. And psilocybin seems to be a very effective treatment for alcohol dependence. This particular study by Roland Griffiths was fascinating. He actually tried to measure the variable that seems to be most predictive of a positive outcome in all the other research, which is a sense of a mystical experience. When people have a profound mystical experience, they tend to be effective at what they're trying to treat. So he said, we need to measure this variable. because it seems to be the criteria of success of the other research. So he gave people a large dose of psilocybin, and then he went back 14 months later and he measured what he saw. Now I'd like to apologize for this slide. From a PowerPoint perspective, it is slide from hell. I acknowledge that. But the numbers are absolutely fascinating. If you look at the column under 30 here, and then you look at this as the 14-month follow-up. So this was 30 milligrams. So this was the highest dosage of psilocybin. And then he went back 14 months later and said, what happened to those people? And he looked at issues like positive attitudes towards life, positive attitudes towards self, positive mood changes, increased sense of spirituality, and how meaningful was this experience in your whole life, and how spiritual was this experience in your whole life. And what he noticed is that 14 months later, the numbers went up. Now, I can't think of any other medical or psychiatric or psychological intervention that you would do with somebody, and then 14 months after the intervention, you go back and you ask the same questions. How effective was you on this variable? And you would observe an increase in effect 14 months later. So what I've described so far is what's happening in the labs of the various universities. But there is also a researcher whose name is Peter Hendricks, and he asked some absolutely fascinating questions. And he went into what's called naturalistic use, like people who use it in community. Nothing to do with laboratory use, just people who use it in their lives. And he, first of all, went into the corrections database. And he found 25,000 records in the National Corrections in the United States. And when you're going to jail, they ask you lots of questions about your drug use. And so they have a pretty significant database. So what we understand prevents recidivism, which is going back to jail after you've been in jail. What we understand prevents recidivism is stable family housing and employment. Stable family housing and employment. And then he went in and looked, and what he found is, yes, people who get stable family and housing and employment tend to have low recidivism rates. And then he looked at drug use patterns. And he found that people who smoke crack cocaine, for example, have much greater recidivism rates. They go back to jail really quickly. If you smoke crack when you come out of jail, you go back to jail. And then he looked at psychedelic use. And how he did that was through the diagnosis they were given of hallucinogen use disorder. And in order to get that diagnosis, you have to use psychedelics. And he found that the use of psychedelics was more protective of recidivism than stable family, housing, and employment. Wow. He was so interested, he went and found another database, and this had 190,000 records in it, 190,000 records. And it was the National Health Survey database. And he looked at suicidality, attempting suicide and thinking about suicide. And he looked at protective factors. And what he noticed is one of the greatest protective factors against suicidality and risk for suicidality was use of psychedelics. Absolutely fascinating. Now, this particular research study, I really like. And partly I really like it because of the title. The efficacy, tolerability, and safety of serotonergic psychedelics for the management of mood, anxiety, and substance use disorders, a systematic review of systematic reviews. You kind of just love that one. I mean, you just have to appreciate it. And so this was the definitive statements about psychedelics in the research today. And what he concluded was psychedelics are back. We see them now as being significant treatments for a whole variety of different mental health disorders. I want to show you an image that helps to understand what we're looking at here. This is the human brain normally. By normally, I mean these are the parts of the human brain. For example, the visual cortex. And what you notice, the visual cortex talks a lot to the visual cortex. And it doesn't talk a lot to the other parts of the brain. This is the human brain under the influence of psilocybin, one of the classical psychedelics. And what we see is a massive increase in the number of connections. That starts to explain all of the research that we're seeing. So psychedelics, really, my way of understanding psychedelics is they're all about connections. Connection to self as an individual, connection to meaning and purpose to life, connection to spirituality, connection to community, and connection to family. I want to just reflect before I end on a paper that I wrote, which is looking at how psychedelic, where we're going, what's the future? Because criminalization of psychedelics doesn't work, but if we started selling LSD at corner stores to kids and candy mints and gummy bears, it would probably be an absolutely huge mistake. So myself and Brian Emerson, who works with the Health Officer Council of British Columbia, the voice of public health in the province of British Columbia, and Ken Tupper, who at this point in time was the middle-level manager in the Ministry of Health provincially, got together and said, let's articulate a model for psychedelic use. And what we came up with was, well, let's look at the harms. And we need to minimize the harms and maximize the benefits. So what are the harms? The harms for all drugs are either dependency, toxicity, and behavior. With psychedelics, I worked for the addiction services for 30 years. Nobody ever walked in my office saying, I can't stop taking LSD. It just doesn't happen. The dependency to psychedelics is virtually zero. Toxicity is also really low. In fact, one can argue that one of the least toxic substances around. So really all of the problems that happen with psychedelics are essentially one thing, which is lack of supervision. Lack of somebody who has a thoughtful oversight and controls the situation and controls set, setting, safety, and dosage issues. Set being the expectations and how you're thinking about it. Setting being the environment. Dosage being what people take and how much. And all of that is under the issue of safety. When psychedelics are used with careful management of set, setting, safety, and dosage issues, what we see is a maximization of benefit and a minimization of harms. Therefore, we advocate for the creation of a new profession. We believe that people should be licensed to be psychedelic supervisors. And they should make their services available in the context of a profession similar to physicians. So there'd be a college that people could complain to, and they'd be responsible for advocating for best practices in their community. And they would be responsible for setting, safety, and dosage issues for 8 hours after ingestion. And we believe that that would maximize the benefits and minimize the harms of psychedelic substances. And because Milton is waving at me here, I will say this is the future of psychedelics. Questions?
Just step here for one moment. Thank you, Mark, for turning us on to psychedelics. The data certainly speak to the effectiveness, and anyone looking for a career change, here's your guide. But seriously, the way we thank our speakers at Rotary is with donation to the polio campaign. We've been working since the 80s to eradicate polio, and in your name, enough money will be donated to protect 50 children from polio. And just last week, believe it or not, India was declared polio-free for 5 years. That's quite something. And now we will invite Joe, our Sergeant at Arms, to walk around and take questions from Mark.
Look at that, there's interest here. Good speech. I was wondering if you could get some of that psychedelic stuff to the bozos. And the one that bonds people, I could use someone like somebody to bond with me. Okay, John.
I noticed there's a brief flash of cannabis on one of your slides that you didn't mention or talk about. What is your opinion of that and its effects vis-a-vis psychedelics?
There is cannabis going on with PTSD treatment. It's not treatment. It reduces the symptoms it appears to reduce the symptoms under some conditions for people with severe PTSD, but it doesn't treat PTSD. So cannabis within our community is not being proposed as a treatment. It's being proposed as a symptom management tool.
You mentioned that it doesn't seem to have very many harmful effects compared to a lot of other chemical substances out there. But have you been able to do long enough studies to find out the long-term effects for people who are using it to treat PTSD or depression or anything like that, say 20 years or on, if they're using it?
Very good question. Thank you very much. So part of our treatment only gives people access 3 times. It is not used ongoingly. It is an incredibly intense psychotherapeutic process that ends after 3 sessions. And yes, we're doing long-term follow-ups with everybody that is part of our research, and all of the long-term follow-ups demonstrate that it is enduring as an effective treatment.
Okay, one other question. I noticed you only had one quick reference to ayahuasca. There seems to be a real subculture around that because there is that community effect, but it doesn't seem to be mainstream. Can you comment further?
Yeah, absolutely. Ayahuasca is dimethyltryptamine that is made orally active with harmaline. And it's used in indigenous ceremonies throughout North America, and it's being exported around the world. And it's very hard to do research on it because it's not a standardized brew. There's a whole variety of different things they're putting in. It's plant-based, and it's very hard to synthesize that. So ayahuasca, it doesn't have a lot of research attention, other than people that go into the communities use it a lot and say, how are these communities experiencing this? Because some people, what's interesting for me is there's no age restriction in the traditional Amazonian ayahuasca experiences within communities. So pregnant women show up, newborns show up, toddlers show up, and they use ayahuasca for decades and their entire life. So it's fascinating to go in and see, is there any harm done to these people from using the substance literally from birth? And the answer appears to be no. They seem to be just fine.
Thanks. You'd mentioned that in your studies they're given 3 doses and then that's it. Can you speak to the popularity of like microdosing some of these substances or taking small doses for longer periods of time? Your opinion of that?
Yes, I'm doing some research on that now. I'm doing a microdosing survey. And to be honest with you, I don't know. It has a huge level of popularity, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence saying that it helps with creativity and it's an antidepressant. If it was, it would be wonderful, but we don't really know because we also know there's a powerful placebo effect involved. So we don't know the answer to that question yet. I hope to answer that, and there's a whole bunch of researchers who would like to explore that. And the only way to explore is with placebo. So take a placebo piece of paper, take a microdose piece of paper, and then how is your depression? And because of the placebo effect is so strong with psychedelics, it's very hard to answer. But what's interesting for me, one of my reasons that I'm really interested in microdosing is I met somebody with schizophrenia who I've now got to know. In fact, I'm writing the book of its story because his story is so fascinating. And schizophrenia is the high-hanging fruit of the psychedelic research tree. Researchers do not want to touch it. Psychedelics are generally seen as being destabilizing to schizophrenics. And so it's absolutely fascinating to me that I know somebody really well now who has schizophrenia. He has voices in the corner of the room like loudspeakers yelling at him, and they judge him and they tell him to do bad things. And he, after about a 15-year period of experimentation, has found that when he microdoses either psilocybin or LSD, the voices don't go away, but they change. And they go from being negative, condemning, and judgmental to being positive, loving, and encouraging to do good things. That's fascinating because current treatments for schizophrenia are really, they don't work very well and they have huge negative side effects. If there was something that did that, it will change psychiatry. So far, I have an N of 1. And I would really like to know if there's anybody else on the planet that's having this experience. I don't know the answer to that yet.
Okay, I kept this guy waiting a long time because he gets excited.
I can see that.
Ouch. I may be biased because I grew up in funeral service, so when you see a classmate who danced off a 14th floor balcony and what's left of him, it's pretty terrifying. But one of my best friends was sent by CBC to interview Timothy Leary in the 60s. And Leary gave him a Coca-Cola laced with acid, and he turned into a vegetable. So I'm just trying to understand, what do you mean there's no outcomes?
I didn't say there's no outcomes. What I said is what we can observe through carefully managed, with all of the research, the people who have done a safety analysis of all of the research that's happened in the last decade. what we have seen is there are no significant adverse events. So what you just finished telling me are horrible examples where setting, safety, and dosage issues were not well managed. So yes, if you lose control of setting, safety, and dosage things, horrible things happen, absolutely. And so that's why we need to carefully manage these experiences within the context of setting, safety, and dosage.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
and if you drink too much water, you can have a problem.
I've got a couple of questions.
Sure.
You mentioned addiction trauma. You could add things like brain injury and other things. It gets me wondering, it becomes very difficult to come up with a diagnosis. So what you're advocating in terms of having a profession that would monitor and regulate the use of the medication, you would first need to have a diagnosis that everyone believes in and trusts, and that can be a very difficult thing to achieve. And the second question is, in the Vietnam War, apparently, I have read that something like over 20% of soldiers returned addicted to, I'm not sure whether it's psychedelics or what, but after opiates. So after a period of time, they come back into the normal percentages. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure. So the study in the Vietnam vets, yes, they came back addicted there because they're in pain. They were addicted to opiate drugs. And the fascinating piece of that research is they tended to recover without addictions treatment because the context changed dramatically. They went from the war situation back home where it was peaceful, and they didn't go on to continue their addiction mostly. So that's an interesting challenge in terms of just understanding how addiction functions. That was your second question.
Diagnosis.
Oh, diagnosis. So yes, we have to screen. So the screening mostly today is about personality disorders and schizophrenia and psychosis-based issues. So those are the exclusion criteria mostly. And so they're not that difficult to screen for. Do you have psychosis? Do you have schizophrenia? Has your family? Has it been in your family? What kind of trauma history do you have? So, those aren't that difficult to diagnose for, and we do successfully screen for those in the research that we do.
And as a psychiatrist, I recommend psychedelics. Bring them on. I'm kidding.
All right.
No, psychedelics okay, but I'm not a psychiatrist. Somebody says I need one though.
What president? Not just one.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we gotta go. Yeah, no talking. Here, John, make it quick.
Back in the 60s and 70s when I grew up, there were a lot of people who dropped acid, and I had a lot of friends who did that. How do you see your research in terms of legalizing, and I assume that this is all part of the whole aspect of it, and that it will end up on the street and people dropping acid like they used to in the 60s and 70s?
So I will gaze into my crystal ball and predict. So I believe what will happen first is we're on the track of legalizing MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD in about 4 years. The Americans are starting to make it available through the context of special access this year. We want to expand the off-label window. What does he mean by that? It means that we want to have more and more indications and more psychedelics used that are authorized by Health Canada. And we believe that they will, and then we want to train therapists. We want to train hundreds of therapists across Canada open clinics. And so will there be diversion is one of your questions. And I believe that there probably will be, but not a lot. Because what we know is that we have to manage the drug very closely, and we have to have people accountable for it because the Health Canada is looking very closely at us for that. So we need to be accountable to prevent diversion. But I also believe that slowly as these things re-enter mainstream psychiatry, which I believe they will, there will be an understanding that they can be used not just to minimize mental health issues, but also to maximize benefits in people who are healthy normals. A sense of spirituality and meaning to purpose to life is completely reasonable. And so I would like to see adults being able to access these experiences without having a diagnosis. Now, if you have the choice of taking this medicine that is extremely strong that results in you not being that in control of your ego in the context of either supervision by a trained professional or lying at home with your kids bouncing off your lap. You're probably going to choose a trained professional. And so my belief is that if we can normalize this within the context of the trained professional, we will maximize the benefits and minimize the harms. One last comment. All of our research is funded by people. No pharmaceutical companies have stepped up to the plate, and they won't because they can't patent these medicines. So if anybody would like to talk to me about donations, I am available for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to hear your speech and your passion for your work and the topic. Before we wrap up, tune in next week where we'll be featuring woman rabbi. Her name is Rabbi Roki Bernstein, and her speech will be on the Exodus, then and now, the journey called life. She's a real interesting person. Before we leave, please rise, and I'd like to have a toast. The toast this week is to the verified better living through psychedelics. Thank you for coming. Have a great week. You may now drop out.